and to speak. I want to introduce tonight's lecturer. Welcome. I'm Carrie Nelson. I'm Dean of the School of Architecture at the BAC. And as many of you know, the BAC has been recognized with distinction for its leadership role in educating an extraordinarily diverse student body to help bring about social equity through the design of landscapes, of architecture, of interior architecture, of historic architecture, of sustainable spaces, of spaces for human health. And we continue to be at the forefront of learning from practice and academic study with guidance from our brilliant faculty members and practitioners. It's my pleasure to introduce the BAC's third event in the student-sponsored lecture series this fall. One of the many things that impressed me about Katherine Williams is how determined she is to fully inhabit the many capacities she brings to architectural practice. Katherine Williams is a mentor. Katherine Williams is an architect. She's a writer and a publisher. She's knowledgeable about construction and the processes of the design professions. When I heard Katherine Williams speak, I was so inspired, I reached out immediately to invite her to reach this audience of beginning students and the larger community. Following Katherine Williams' graduation from Howard University, she worked in architecture firms in Virginia. She worked on projects in historic preservation, municipal facilities, and adaptive reuse. She became a Rose Architectural Fellow focused on community engagement and affordable housing in California. In 2012, she managed the construction of commercial office projects in Northern Virginia and led the creation of construction administration department for an architecture firm. Since early 2020, Williams has managed construction projects for Georgetown University. Outside the office, Williams has served on the AIA Richmond board as a Girl Scout troop leader, as editor of the National Organization of Minority Architects, or NOMA magazine, and as a chair and member of the American Institute for Architects Housing Community Development Knowledge Community Advisory Group. She has been published and has presented at numerous conferences over the past 15 years. She was a recipient of the 2013 NOMA Founders Award and the 2016 AIA Virginia Emerging Professionals Award. As one of 500 African-American licensed women architects in the US, which is about 0.4% of all US licensed architects, Williams has a distinctive perspective that's not always represented in the media. Very little research and statistics exist about what these women are doing in their careers and how to increase this number. Katherine helps track the statistics and writes about the numbers. More recently, she's been working collaboratively on the Black Women in Architecture Network. This effort has included organizing an annual brunch in DC for Black women in the profession for the past 5 years. The 2020 event went virtual with over 100 participants from around the US. Please give a warm welcome to Katherine Williams as she presents her talk, Harnessing the Vortex, Maximizing a Career in Architecture.
I'm just going to share my screen.
Please do.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for that introduction, which is like a little bit of like everything I'm going to talk about. So thank you. And thanks to Boston Architectural College for inviting me to speak as part of the fall lecture series. Thank you everyone for joining me. I appreciate having all the students here, as well as just scrolling through. I saw some of my colleagues here as well. So thanks to all of them for joining me. So I titled this talk, Harnessing the Vortex, Maximizing a Career in Architecture. And for many that don't know me, as Karen said, I've been one quarter of the panelists known as Riding the Vortex. And actually, let me step back 1 second. I forgot I added some stuff to my slides. Hold on. This is just a short overview kind of where I'm going to go in the talk tonight. And then let's go to the first slide. So I've been 1/4 of the panel known as Riding the Vortex. Usually this group is a panel presentation of 4 or 5 African-American women. And the session started in 2007 when Catherine Prigmore was advising and mentoring Barbara Laurie toward the tenure process at Howard University. They created the panel to highlight the stories of Black women architects. At the time, as Karen said, there was very little publicity. There had been a few articles in like Ebony magazine, highlighting 10 or 12 Black women architects. And actually that had been done a couple of times over the years, but other than that, there was very little public work about Black women in particular in architecture. And also at the time, around 2007, there were less than 200 licensed Black women architects. I met Barbara and Kathy 10 years prior because I was a student at Howard University, and I was asked to join the panel in the early career slot. So the Vortex is a metaphor, particularly for African-American women in architecture as we face racism, sexism, and other barriers throughout our careers. At the session, each woman is at a different stage in her career, from early career graduates to executive level professionals. We invite different women to the panels, and as you can see this list, we have done this session almost 24 times now since 2007, and usually depending on what location we are in that city, it's a mix of the four of us, and then we invite another woman, usually local to that area, so that we're getting a local perspective on the panel as well. So we'll be doing our 24th iteration next week, actually, as part of AIA Virginia's Architecture Exchange East Conference. So if you're interested particularly in writing the Vortex, that's a good opportunity to hear from a panel of us there. Over the 13 years that we have conducted the panel, we have seen the number of African-American women architects more than double. Just this month, the number of living African-American women architects licensed in the US crossed the 500 line. And for context, for people who one say that that's a really small number, yes, it is. There are about 116,000 licensed architects in the US, according to NCARB. So our group makes up approximately 0.4% of that total. The Directory of African American Architects was created in the 1980s, and it has been a crucial tool to allow us to track that number. And so that's what you see here. The statistics here are basically from that directory every year, what the progress is. And then I also wanted to show, this is a graph kind of from the 1980s when the directory was started to today. And you can see that the number of women at the bottom in the dark blue line, the number of men in the pink, and the total, which I didn't put the number on here, but it's about 2,400 total African-American architects licensed in the US. So about 2%. And that 2% is actually held pretty steady, even though the number of architects has increased. That proportion as far as African-American architects has pretty much remained the same for almost the last 15 years. One of the other things that our panel has done is invite other African-American women to the panel, and it has been a launching pad for them to go on to create programs of their own. So this is just a sample of some of the women who have been on the panel and programs that they have started. Several of them are doing programs that are also trying to increase the number of Black women architects, African-American women architects in the US, dealing with either camps for kids or programs for kids. Melissa Daniel, the first person, does a podcast series and has led the Women in Architecture lecture series, both locally in the DC area and nationally. And then you can see the other programs that are there. I encourage you to check those out if you're interested in that work, and also interested in helping sort of support the effort to help increase not only the number of African-American women in architecture, but diversity in the profession as well. So the other thing that I wanted to say was that my talk here, I'm gonna go back one slide because they're a little out of order. The Writing the Vortex, we do have a Facebook page. So if people are interested, it's a place where socially and publicly we can sort of network. Articles are posted there regularly. And the website as well is a place for us to hold that information. So trying to track articles, trying to promote achievements of Black women architects in the US, but also there's a list of those programs as well as programs internationally that we know that are out there that are not only supporting US Black women, but Black women in London, in Africa, in the architecture profession. So one of the things that I also wanted to say was that the talk today, Harnessing the Vortex, I chose that title because I hope to show that despite sort of the obstacles that we all know, being a Black woman in the architecture profession, that I hope that my journey and my talk is a way to show you all how I've maximized the opportunities I did have. And so that's why I chose that part as the second part of the title, Maximizing a Career. Because when we look at the word maximize, it means to make as large or as great as possible, but also to make the best of or to make the most out of what you have. And so I thought about, when I thought about my career, at multiple points, I sought to make the most of my skill, not only my skills, but also the resources, my network, and the opportunities that came my way. So I'm gonna back up now and sort of like start from the beginning of when I first learned about architecture. So for me, it started when I was a child, and making the most of what I was given started at a young age for me. So my mom put me in Girl Scouts at our church at the earliest age possible, which was I think 8. And around that time, I went to a Girl Scout sponsored career fair and I met an architect. That in me sparked an interest in design. And my mom, who always supported my aspirations, started sending me to every camp or workshop that she heard about that was related to architecture or design. I attended a STEM camp at a local university. I participated in the Explorer program at local firms in the Richmond area. And I spent 2 weeks at a Girl Scout architecture experience camp in South Carolina. I also enrolled as the only girl in my high school drafting class. And before I was looking at universities, I knew about the different degree programs and had taken the drafting class, but had also met several architects and engineers. So I had gotten exposure to the profession. And my mother believed that no opportunity was out of reach despite location or cost. And I think that she was probably the first person, maybe other than like my grandmother or other family members, that taught me about maximizing opportunities. So during that time, I was introduced to the profession. I saw representation by meeting a woman first and also interacting with architects from my hometown. And then I was exposed to a myriad of aspects of architecture through all the programs that I did from that early age through high school. After that time, when I was thinking about choosing a college, I sort of took that same attitude of grabbing every opportunity to earn an architecture degree. I knew nothing about Howard University until a brochure arrived in my mailbox late in the college process. So you should know that my parents had no money to send me to college, and I believed my job was to maximize my high school experience so that I could get a scholarship to somebody's university. My preference was a 5-year program. After going to the Explorer program, I was new about the different degree programs, and I knew that the 5-year program was the program with the professional degree in the shortest amount of time and at the cheapest cost. And as a side note, I always like to tell people that when I was in college and even afterwards, meeting younger professionals, I was always surprised by college students who did not know there were several degree paths to become an architect. And I hope more students today are actually like researching this as part of their college decision process, because I think it's very important that not only do you consider location and the program itself, but what degree are you actually getting when you come out of that program. So in that time, I think if you believe in God, then you'll probably agree that it was a small miracle that I was able to attend Howard on a full scholarship. A family member who found out I had been accepted by some small miracle knew someone at the university and was able to get my application in front of the decision makers in the financial aid office. So before I left high school, I was given the news that I had granted a full scholarship for that 5 years. And for me, this showed the power of maximizing the network. Once I was enrolled, I just couldn't skate through my 5 years there. And I, of course, sought out every opportunity to maximize my experience. And I tried to be open to trying new things that I hadn't considered before. So for me, that included my first plane trip to a conference in Atlanta. Included getting my first passport. I spent a semester on exchange in Toronto, Canada. And I also said yes to representing my school in student government and spending a summer in Pittsburgh for an HBCU exchange program at Carnegie Mellon. Howard also provided a nurturing environment for me with professors who are still mentors to this day, 20 years later. And I also had classmates who were competitive, but we were willing to share our skills to bring everyone forward. Washington, D.C. also provided my first experience living in a big city and not being car dependent, and this informed much of my personal work going forward, and also my personal life. Being at a HBCU reinforced the attitude that I should maximize the possibilities that were presented to me. And one of my roommates helped me actually get my first design-related job. So she worked at a professional trade organization. And when she was transitioning out of that job, she actually put me up for that position. And that's how I began to be around designers in the professional world. That organization was working with environmental graphic designers, and that training would actually come back to me later in my career. A member of that organization helped me get my first internship after I'd been sort of an admin staff at this organization. One of the members worked in an architecture firm, and when they were hiring interns for the year, he uh, called me and got me a position there as an intern. And so for me, that maximized or showed how I can maximize the prospect of this new network that I was now being sort of walked into. And for a long time, that's sort of like how I went from position to position. It was always about who I knew and how I could leverage the network that I had and the people that I knew. So when I left school, I returned back to my hometown near Richmond, Virginia. And I knew that I should engage with organizations to start building my network and to start my career. I remind you that much of this advancement that I made to this point was predicated on the strength of my network. I also believe others were willing to help me and support me because I reciprocated that throughout my time. After graduation, I assumed that connecting to my local AIA chapter was a good first step. The staff person connecting me with a local architect, and he introduced me to one of his schoolmates who was expanding from a sole proprietorship to a staffed firm. And that first full-time position set the tone for the rest of my career. And additionally, for me, licensure was important, and I felt determined to make the chapter live up to what I assumed was the purpose of the organization, to help local architectural professionals. And for me, that meant helping me get through my exams. As with many volunteer organizations, if you have an idea, you become the one to implement it. So at a year or so out of school, I was serving on the chapter board and I was restarting the ARE prep program. The photos here show a Kids Day event that I helped plan for Architecture Week one year while I was on the board for AIA Richmond. And for me, there were so many lessons here, how to be on a nonprofit board, how to run an event, how to get work done with professionals who were usually older, mostly white, and mostly male. I think it helped that we were all volunteers working towards the goal of making the chapter the best for our members. And again, an unexpected opening, being on that board, helped me to maximize this phase in my career. So going back to that first job, for me, it was in the traditional path of architecture. And as I'll talk about my path, it's been a very winding one. And I always tell people that the traditional path is great, but that's not the only path. And so hopefully this kind of gives you a little bit of insight into that and like how you can think about not only an architect in a firm, but also an architect on other paths and other roles in the process of construction and design. So that first full-time position, the firm did architecture, they did graphic design, and they did museum work. So I was circling back to that environmental graphic design that I mentioned earlier, that I was exposed to about 2 years before. I worked on restoring a 19th century house to its 1800s condition, and that's the drawings that you see there on the left. That project required me to work with a historian, to do many on-site measuring trips, to draw one-to-one wood trim details to create this transformation for this property. I was also working on general aviation terminals, which you see the first picture on the right, and then several museum projects. And the museum projects really, like I said, attached back to that environmental graphic design because I was working with the graphic designer on staff to draw maps in InDesign, to think about layouts for museums and how the layout of the museum exhibits and even the museum furniture, how that all laid out in the space, and also to think about what we were presenting. Sometimes this was also included print brochures and online presence for the actual entity that we were designing the space for. So it was sort of all of the services wrapped around and not just the building and not just the interior space. And being at that small firm gave me a lot of exposure to a lot of disciplines that I probably wouldn't have gotten necessarily at a larger firm. But because, at that firm, it was one principal, two interns, and a graphic designer. and we were kind of expected to do everything. In hindsight, I was spoiled by the familiar atmosphere. I had great coworkers, but my boss's son, which I guess I just had a appearance from my daughter, um, my boss's son was frequently at our office, and he had no issues with me prioritizing my family, and my schedule could be flexible when I needed it to be. And I expected that of every work environment going forward. Um, it was sort of, uh, something that I had valued and something that I looked for when I went to jobs after that. I also learned as much as I could because everyone was allowed to contribute ideas from the office decor to the office CAD standards to how our project designs were done. And for example, the steps that you see here on the left, I had the idea to paint these steps because we were up on the second floor and there was, as you can see, there's a door there with the open glass, which we could see up, but not very much. And we had like a small sticker sign. You can kind of see it at the bottom. But that was the only signage that we had. So I asked my boss, I'm like, hey, we could do something with these stairs and that could be our signage. So when you close the door, you can actually see the A, which is the company logo from the outside. And again, I was in an environment where maximizing opportunities was encouraged, and also sort of our design ideas were encouraged. We were encouraged to implement them. I also spent a few years at a large firm because I'd been at a small firm for a few years and I felt like I needed to go to a large firm just to see what that experience was like. I was able to see how a large firm with layers of staff structure operates, but I also was able to work with several disciplines because the firm included in-house engineers, interior designers, and construction administrators. I also received exposure to the firm finances, which I think this is something that not a lot of firms always share with their staff, but this firm had quarterly staff meetings, which they shared kind of which markets were doing well, which markets were not profitable, and also just the general state of the firm from a financial standpoint. So after my time there, about 5 years into my career, and after working for 3 firms, I started looking around and sort of thinking about like where I wanted to be in my career, and also the things that I was learning, but also the things that I wanted to learn. I knew that I wanted a different experience. In school, I wondered how I, as an architect, could bring abandoned buildings back to life. I did attend Howard University, and in the 90s, DC still had a lot of vacant or boarded up property. And so as an architect, I think we're always thinking about like how you can change a building, how you can bring life back to a building. And so I think in school, we learned about the design, but not necessarily the initiation of that process. And so we were always, I felt like in the firms that I was working at, I was doing historic preservation. And as I said, doing designs for buildings, but I was always waiting, or we were always waiting for developers and other clients. We weren't necessarily starting the project or going to acquire a property or anything like that. And that was something that I was really interested in. So a few years out of school, I learned about the Enterprise Rose Fellowship, a program that places architects in community development organizations, and the architects learn how to implement development projects, and the organization gets an architect on staff full time. So I had this new goal. Usually those organizations, may have like an executive director and they may have some support staff, but most times they don't have architects on staff, and that's something that they hire out. So they're always dependent on hiring someone. And I like to say that even when you hire someone, you know that your project is not always their priority. So by bringing an architect on staff, these organizations could have a designer who knew about buildings and knew about design all, every day thinking about their projects. After a few false starts and a change in the program structure, I was accepted into the fellowship in 2006, about 5 years into my career. However, this meant that my path no longer looked like the path that was prescribed for me from school and also from traditional practice protocol. It also meant that I moved across the country. So I left Virginia and moved to California, San Francisco to be exact. But this was the opportunity of my dreams because I was attending community meetings, I was having project discussions with neighbors and stakeholders, I was engaging in city council meetings, I was monitoring proposed neighborhood developments and zoning and planning steps. I was learning pro formas and scouting property to acquire, among other tasks. I also, sorry, one more thing. So that's this slide shows some neighborhood meetings that I attended sort of as the staff person for the community development organization. So this organization was in the southeast corner of San Francisco. And at the time in 2006, 2007, that area had a large site that had been an industrial site that was getting ready to undergo redevelopment. And there was also a parcel next to Candlestick Park, if you know San Francisco. The 49ers had left Candlestick Park. So not only was the old stadium going to be redeveloped, but there was sites around it that were going to be redeveloped. So that neighborhood had a lot of development that was happening, and part of my role there was to sort of like figure out how all that was going to impact the neighborhood. And we ended up writing a document to help the neighbors sort of like have a tangible document of all this development that was happening, and sort of like the number of units that were projected, and traffic, and like I said, the impact to this neighborhood. I also worked for a second organization that was in, so the first organization was in the Visitation Valley neighborhood, and then I worked for an organization that was in the Bayview neighborhood, which is a little slightly north of Visitation Valley. And I worked on a project that was construction of a condo building that you see the rendering for in the drawing there. But that condo building was seen as sort of a catalyst for this corner in the neighborhood. And so part of my role there was looking at all the sites around that building. And particularly there was a city-owned site that has a opera house, it has a park site, and it has a gym. And so thinking about how those sites could work together and actually be sort of a center for the neighborhood. They were kind of operating all as individual, but we sort of saw from other projects that we looked at around the country, like how that site could really be a catalyst for the neighborhood and be a place a destination in the neighborhood where there wasn't really one necessarily. Part of my role there was also looking at other sites. So the garden that you see there is a vacant site that we actually acquired. It had been really just a fenced vacant lot, and people threw trash in it. So we acquired that site looking forward for future development possibilities. But while we were waiting for that to happen, we worked with local community groups and made a garden. So we built boxes on top of the, I guess what was asphalt, basically a parking lot there, and had the garden. And the restaurant that was in the building across the street, which was the condo building, this building, there's a restaurant that went in the ground floor here. The chef there worked with community groups to harvest the vegetables and food that was grown here for the restaurant. So kind of creating this circular cycle in the neighborhood where this vacant lot was now being used for something that was going to help sustain the community, and that was also becoming an asset for the community versus the eyesore that it had been. During that time, I also, as I mentioned before, we're doing performas, which again is something that not a lot of architects are necessarily doing. Part of my role with looking at these sites is sort of putting together the performa and thinking about how we were going to fund developments that we were doing, what sources were out there, whether it was grants, whether it was state or city funds, and trying to think about what we could do to make the development happen and make those projects real. So that, for me, that was something that I was really seeking because, like I said before, as an architect, we're usually waiting for the clients or waiting for a developer to come to us. And in this role, I was the developer, right? I was going out and looking for the sites and figuring out how to make them work for our organization. We were a nonprofit, so the profit structure wasn't necessarily the goal and necessarily the priority, but making the sites benefit the community was. I also got my license during that time, and I just put this in here because I think for me, passing the exams was an important step. One of the reasons I went to architecture school, even though I had learned a lot about other design paths, was I felt as an architect I could do multiple things Whereas if I had gone as a graphic designer or industrial designer and then wanted to be an architect later, I would have had to go back to school or rethink how I was going to get there. So I felt like with an architecture degree, I could do any of those things because I was learning about design, but also then learning about the buildings. And when I was getting my license, I had done my intern hours in Virginia and I had passed one exam. Thank you for ARE prep that I organized. I had passed one exam before I left. And then I took a year off because that was the time that I moved to California. So I took a pause and basically focused on moving and the transition. And in 2010, I did get my license and I was approximately number 251, sorry, on the list of African-American licensed. That's how many that were licensed when I got mine in 2010. During the 6 years that I was in San Francisco, I also wanted to mention that not only is work important, but fun is important. So in San Francisco, new tech was starting, sort of its second resurgence, I guess, because of the iPhone and almost everyone getting a smartphone, at least everyone on the West Coast. And in the Bay Area, in the city, residents were also fighting gentrification on many fronts, and the Giants were winning the World Series every other year. So for me, not only did I look at maximizing my professional life, but I also tried to maximize personal fun in the city. And I wanted to put this in here because I didn't want to just focus all on work. And I think that having a life outside of work is just as important as well. In 2012, I took a pause in my career to take care of my terminally ill mother. Cancer sucks, by the way. And I, just like every other transition, this is transition. This is one where I had to make the best use of the tools before me. One of the best things about living in California, I would say during that period in my life, was that I was able to tap into the family leave benefits that came with working in California. And for me, that allowed me to take some time off of work and replace my income for several months. And it gave me time with my mother that I needed. And a small bit of state policy allowed me to take that pause. And so I moved from San Francisco back to the suburbs of Richmond. And that allowed me, as I said, to make the most of that time. When I was ready to go back to work, I like to say that I went to that third leg of the stool, the third iteration. When I was ready to go back into the workforce, I was facing a really different economy, and this was like around 2013. And I was in a community that I had been separated from for 6 years. So in the work that I was doing before, community development work, a lot of that is predicated on your connection to the community, your connection to people who live there, and your connection to what is happening as far as city council and policy, state policy. And I just didn't have that because I've been away for 6 years. And I also knew that a traditional firm was not probably going to be my ultimate path. I eventually landed at a general contracting company, and I was hired to assist the owner with primarily interior office renovation and university projects. I had a valuable skill because I was an architect and I could read plans, but I could also put together a project budget because of my development experience. And I grew in that position over 5 years. And by the end of my time there, I was running $1 million construction projects. And for the umpteenth time, I was able to maximize what was presented to me. And additionally, my current daytime role, also in construction management, is is the result of providing great results to a client that I had in that first general contracting job. And he's now a coworker, and as I act as an owner's rep and construction project manager for Georgetown University. So that's kind of my career up to now. This sort of winding path leads me to today. But I omitted a lot that also contribute to and supported my career. So first, I had an essay published in a book early in my career, which is what you see on the left. And that's actually how I got to Boston the first time, because that led to an opportunity for me to be on a panel at the AIA Boston conference in 2004. And that essay at the time in 2003, when I wrote it, it's called "Where Are the Architects That Look Like Me?" Because I didn't see any Black female architects in any of the work that I was doing in any of the firms that I was at. And so coming out of Howard University and then being in an environment where I didn't see almost none, very few people who looked like me in my profession, I sort of wrote this essay just on my thoughts on that and sort of like how that was not necessarily affecting my career, but my thoughts on like how the profession needed to change. So writing and presenting became an integral process for me, integral way for me to process and speak out and also support others professionally. During that time, I edited several publications. I did the AIA National Associates Committee newsletter for a year, and then I edited the NOMA magazine for 5 years. So my editing work led to an author, Melvin Mitchell, asking me to step into the role as publisher. And this was last summer. He called me up and said, "Hey, I like the work that you did on the NOMA magazine. Are you interested in publishing a book?" And of course, me, never saying no to anything, said, "Yes, of course, I can do that." Before last year, I had considered, of course, writing a book about Black women in architecture and the profession in general. But now I was being asked to manage the whole process from manuscript to the physical book being on a shelf. So it was a 6-month learning journey. But again, I tapped into my resources, my network, the vast depth of information online. And now I have a book that's published, and it provides a thesis and some steps to increase the number of African American architects in the US. One of the other things that I have worked on as far as publishing is arcstories.com. For me, knowing the importance of licensure, I created this website to publish stories from architects to inspire those who are trying to get licensed. And this sort of came out of my time when I was getting licensed. There was a small group of us who had met at an AIA conference. And so we started talking to each other about how we could support each other through the licensure process, because we were all sort of starting to take our exams or taking our exams. And one of the things I did was I started reaching out to people who already knew were licensed and asked them if they would just like write about their experience, sort of as an inspiration, but a first person account of what it was like when you were taking your exams. And I tried to get people from various generations. So if you go to the website now, it goes back to the 1980s all the way forward to today. And most people believe that they don't have something important to say, but by asking people to share their stories about this milestone in their career, architects start to reminisce on that period. And they also start to appreciate the hard work that they did to become licensed. And right now you can read over 20 stories on the website. And so I hope that that is a resource for young professionals as they are going through that process. Today, my organizing work has involved to thinking about who is in our profession and how do we make sure that we as Black women are at the table and succeeding. This is especially needed as development occurs and is stressing predominantly Black communities, and also as we realize that we bring a different set of priorities to projects. So a week ago, we held the 6th Black Women in Architecture brunch virtually. I started this event in 2015. I actually didn't know until a couple of years ago that a similar event had happened in the DC area in the 80s and 90s, but it had sort of fallen off and hadn't happened in a while. And I did this because I realized that in the DC area, which is one of the areas with the highest concentration of Black architects and Black women architects, we didn't know each other. So the first event, we had about 40 women, and we were all stuffed into a small conference room that we borrowed from a local firm for a few hours on a weekend. And I had a friend who did catering, and she catered the event. And afterwards, people asked me when I was going to do it again. And so now it's been 5 years, and we're still doing this on an annual basis. Last month, we had over 100 attendees, which nearly doubled our in-person attendance. And we attracted women from throughout the US because of the magic of the internet. And the goal of the event really is to provide a platform for us to meet, for us to network, and so we can know each other and support each other throughout our careers. So as you see here, a few photos, and I'm not sure, hopefully they're not blurry on your end, they're a little blurry on my end, but so photos from past events. And then out of that event, I started thinking about a logo. So we created a logo, which has now been on merchandise. So you see a few women there with t-shirts with the Black Women Architecture logo. And then once we started doing the event, we started asking firms and other local organizations to sponsor it. We had funds to run the event, but then we had extra funds, and we were like, what are we going to do with this money? Tragically, one of our own was killed in 2015. And as a way to honor her memory, we started a scholarship which supports women during their exams. So we give out funds that women can use to help pay for their exam. And this year we'll probably expand that to also assisting with like study materials, because we're trying to address the needs in our community as far as the things that are stopping people, putting barriers in front of them as far as getting licensed, because we know that being licensed is a tool and is something that people carry in their career, and it helps them advance in their career. So we try to help as many people, as many Black women especially, get licensed as can. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was my own development project that's sort of been its own vortex for about 6 years, as I try to turn a 6-acre site without city sewer access, which is one of the barriers, into a profitable project and attempt to provide housing for our community. This is land where I grew up. I spent my summers here running back and forth, biking back and forth between my grandmother and my great-grandmother's houses. I watched my great-grandparents plant and grow a garden here every summer, and my family gathered here at my grandmother's house on weekends. So this land has been in my family for 5 generations, and it's adjacent to a cemetery where my grandfather and my great-grandparents are buried, along with other distant relatives. So this project is calling me to sort of draw on the entirety of my last 25 years of experience to bring to fruition something that I hope is a legacy project for my family and my community. And last of all, I did this while raising a daughter. I had to make the best use of family and friends, family and friends that became family to support me in the venture sort of over this last 20 years. In conclusion, I want to say that everyone's going to have opportunities in their career, and many of us will have barriers. I could not have mapped out my path 20 years ago when I was graduating. I tried to see each position and transition, whether voluntary or forced, as a chance to grow both my skills and myself as a person. And as I think on all these experiences, it's not just the experiences that were valuable, but it's also the people that I met along the way. Many of them remain friends and colleagues today, and I continue to learn from their paths and seek their counsel, because I don't think I'll ever be at a point where I stop learning or exploring new ideas. And no matter where you are, always look for the possibility to maximize the opportunity, the project, or the position that you're in. Thank you very much.
That's great, Catherine. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if we could stop sharing the screen so we can see more students and audience members and see if someone wants to ask a question. Any questions from the chat or from an in-person?
I can get the ball rolling.
Please, Richard.
Catherine, you very much inspired me. Your energy has gotten me through my Wednesday and may get me through the rest of my week, and a terrible week that's coming up, I think, next week, but maybe it'll be great. When I see a career that's been laid out as you've done it, and I've written it down: maximize opportunity, leverage network. I will write in my journal from there tomorrow. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I want to ask you, because you put that all in a PowerPoint or in one PDF, if you took a deep breath now, knowing that you have this development project that's so close to your family, what would you want to do next?
Besides that project?
Yeah, dream project, even if it's that taken all of its way, because we just know that it's there. We know that the land is going to be reused. Maybe that's the answer, but I'm always just curious, because I see your trajectory, what do you think is next?
That's what my question was. I was going to ask what's next.
Well, I really need to get that project off the ground. So, I mean, one of the issues is that it's really expensive. So it's not super profitable right now, but for me, it's sort of like a passion project. So I can't just like go on like, oh, it has to earn like 15% profit. So figuring out the financing of that is probably the hardest thing right now. And so I'm trying to sort of like line up like myself financially, but also like, how do I make it attractive maybe to like investors or other people, you know, getting family members on board. to make that happen. And then my goal is like for that to be sort of the first development project, right? It would be like 6, right now it's designed as like 6 single family houses on that site. But you know, to look at also other properties in that area that could be redeveloped, I think would be the next thing, because I'm hoping to sort of learn from that and be able to sort of like turn that into, you know, the next project that comes along.
So Catherine, thank you. I don't know if you can see the chat, but Lewis Smith wrote, what do you do to heal from the pain the profession causes and has caused?
Well, so since the summer, I've been doing yoga daily, almost daily, I should say, which is really, I started doing yoga when I moved back to Virginia in 2012. I had done a little bit of like workshops or meditation stuff, sort of one-off before that. But when I moved back in Virginia, one of the things about not working is that you can access things because they provide scholarships. So our local YMCA had scholarships. And so I was at the Y all the time, and yoga was one of the things that I started doing there. And so since the summer here, I've been doing sort of on my own, like using YouTube videos, and actually like signed up for a yoga teacher training course to sort of learn more. I don't know if I'll ever teach. I will think about that, but yeah, just to like sort of get my practice. And that's what I've been doing daily in the last few months. I think before that, really sort of like doing that brunch was kind of selfish of me, as well as providing for other people, because I think I really thrive off of talking to other people and talking about their stories and learning from their stories and getting support from them, but also providing support. So I think I have a good network of women, especially in architecture throughout the country now. And so just talking with them and, you know, asking questions for them of like, oh, what do you think about this? A lot of times when I've been considering positions or considering next moves, that group is sort of like who I go to. And then like family as well, like having family support. My aunt's in the room, by the way. So just having family support as well. Just, you know, wherever I was. One of the things I didn't mention, when I was in California, my daughter was 4, just about to turn 5. And I had the opportunity, because I was a fellow, to do a lot of traveling and to go to conferences and stuff like that. So one of the things, how I made that work, was that my mom traveled a lot with me and became sort of like my travel babysitter. And so I was able to take advantage of a lot of opportunities because I had that support.
Yeah, Maria.
Hi, Catherine. Again, thank you so much for your lecture. Very, very inspiring, and at a great time in our current history, certainly. I have a question. What might colleges and universities do to assist and encourage more African-American and women to enter into architecture and design programs and into the profession?
So I think at the college level, it's really important to look at recruitment. I'm always like saddened when I hear women talk about being the only one in their class or the only one in their program, as far as either a Black person or a person of color. So I think thinking about recruitment, how you're going to get students into your program, how you're going to support them through the program. For me, I had a really different experience because I was at Howard, which is a historically Black college. So I didn't have that, I wasn't starting out from a place of being an other in a program. And I had professors who were Black, all the students were Black, not only Black from the US, but Black from across the globe. So thinking about how you're going to support students when they get to your program, how you're going to bring them in and how you're going to support them when they get there, I think is the biggest thing that colleges and universities can do. And also, a lot of people talk about studio culture. If your studio culture is just tearing down students when they're doing their projects, they're probably not going to stay. Like, people are going to go to something where they feel more supported and where they feel they can actually succeed. So I think that's something as well.
Thank you.
There are a lot of questions in the chat coming up. One is your main focus or the main value that was motivating you.
I don't know.
All right.
I mean, so I guess like personally, over the last few years, it's really increasing that number, right? Because the more of us that are out here and working, the more that we can work with each other, and the more that people will see it as a normal thing and won't think about like, oh, like the white male is the typical architect and, you know, that's who we have to hire. No, if you see architects who are outside of that realm, then that's going to become normalized. So I think that's been sort of my, like, I think all of the work, even though I'm doing a bunch of different things, it sort of like all comes back to that root about increasing the number of not only Black women architects, but Black architects in general.
Are there any students who want to pose their questions live? You can unmute.
I'm trying to read through some of the questions.
Sure. Your aunt gave you a shout.
So my friend Russell, who is actually one of the first people I met in San Francisco, because he was in the neighborhood that I was working in, asked about getting more people of color interested in architecture and planning as a career. I mean, NOMA has been doing Project Pipeline, which is a camp for middle school students for like the last 10 years at various chapters around the country. And I think some of the things that I pointed out as far as like exposure, like, you know, making it, if kids only think of like doctor and lawyer as the career, then we're going to have a bunch of doctors and lawyers and not a bunch of other career, or they're going to find out about it late and, you know, come to it as a second career, which, you know, then they've, you know, sort of shortened the time that they are doing it. So I think exposure for kids. And then again, back to what I said about the colleges, like once people decide they want to be an architect or interested in it, supporting them through that process and making sure that if they're going to truly succeed, that they have the support, have the network, have the mentors and the advocates to actually get through their career. Other questions? I'll try to read from the chat, but if people have a question, they can speak up. Someone asked, does the Vortex or you have access to resources for women that are looking for scholarships and mentorship? So the Vortex is a volunteer-led entity, venture. So the scholarship, the Desiree Cooper ARE scholarship is sort of the one scholarship that we sort of organize. The AIA has diversity scholarships for college. So that's one resource. And then as far as mentorship, we haven't actively done like a mentorship program. Again, because we're all working. And so we only have so many hours in the day. It just hasn't been a thing where we've had the resources to provide that yet. But it's something that I know that there's a couple of other Black women architecture people who are doing things and thinking about mentorship and how to provide a formal process. I think it's hard for us because we're volunteer and like, you know, but it's easier for larger organizations, I think, to think about that. And I think one of the reasons about the brunch is like, if at least we like get together and see each other's faces, know each other's names, start to know like what sector, what market people are working in, it becomes easier to then call on that person and say, hey, I saw that you do retail design. I'm interested in that. Can you tell me what you're doing, or you know, whatever your question is. So I think even though it's not a formal thing, part of the brunch is sort of like out of that desire to be able to create those connections between people.
I really admire, I'm sorry, someone else is on.
Oh, pardon me. This is Nicholas. Catherine, wonderful presentation. Hey, Catherine. I thought I'd just jump the line and ask my question.
Go ahead.
So as a Zennial, you know, we've had to navigate cultural and generational shifts more than other generations. You know, we grew up analog but had to learn tech. A career in architecture has made these changes more pronounced as we've transitioned from drawing by hand to drawing in 2 dimensions to envisioning in 3. But how have you personally absorbed these changes into your process while remaining confident about what's inside Catherine's toolbox? You see what I did there? Yeah.
Nick is referencing my Facebook page. So I can answer that question, but like I will say to the audience here that I don't draw on a regular basis because I'm managing processes now. So I am hiring architects. Actually, I did get called on, and I have to write a door hardware spec for a project, which is something that I haven't done in a really long time. So I only get called to like do traditional architecture on a very rare basis. Most of the time I'm managing architects because I'm sort of responsible for a whole project to get constructed. So we have a client, I have a university professor or an office or somebody like that, a university office that will come to me and say, we need this space renovated, or we need space for this XYZ thing, whether it's a class or whether it's somebody's office or somebody's lab, help us get that done. So I'm talking to the designers. We have designers in-house. I'm talking to the designers about what they need and what the project will need. And then I'm, trying to talk to the contractors and get that done. So as far as the transition from like analog to digital, well, one, I think I'm not doing it necessarily on drawings like CAD and Revit or anything like that. I did do a little bit of that last year, but I didn't make it a priority to learn Revit. And when I moved to California, I sort of stepped away from traditional architecture. And so even though like I kept like a CAD program on my personal home computer and did like a little bit of drawings through that, I could probably do SketchUp like okay. I wasn't doing drawings necessarily. So the transition for me has probably been more about like how I manage stuff, like as far as like Microsoft Word or Excel or Google Docs, right? How to manage all of that data that is now electronic versus like paper. And so I've always been someone who tried to learn as much as I possible on my own and then sort of ask the question. So like the internet is great because I will search, for 15 minutes, 30 minutes on something that I am trying to learn. Like right now I have a video from another presentation that I'm trying to learn how to like edit that video. So if it's something that I feel like I can do, I'll try to do it. And then if I can't feel like I can do it in an efficient amount of time, or I know someone who's like an expert, then I'll call on them and say, hey, can you do this for me or show me, like, is it a short process to show me to get done what I need to do? So that's kind of like my transition from analog to digital has been more in that sense versus like the CAD and drawing sense.
So Katherine, I want to thank you. It's very clear to me that where you see things that are missing that need to support you and more women and more African-American women in architecture, you've managed without really any funding, but just sheer willpower to kind of create the things that you need. Architecture Stories is another example of it. And I think this is wildly inspiring. There are many more questions in the chat, but we have to close because there are students who have to get to their next class.
Okay.
So I want to ask
if people have questions in the chat, if you send them to me, I'd be happy to answer them or see what I can. So.
Awesome. That's fantastic. And you gave us your email in your final slide. I think it would.
It's actually to my website, which is really easy, KatherineRW.com. Yeah. So, right. And my contact information is there. So, that's one of those. That's one of those digital things. I just had a friend of mine talking about my network. A friend that I know, I actually hired her to do the redesign for that. So, again, that's the power of the network because, she redesigned it and then said, hey, I'm going to give part of my profits from this to your organization. So I, greatly appreciate people's support and people that want to learn more about what I'm doing. So.
All right, that's awesome. I'm asking everyone in the audience, turn off your mute, give Katherine a round of applause so she can hear you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your participation in the lecture series, Katherine.
Thank you.
Good. Have a great evening, everyone.